Let's now tell you about the other big headline of the day. We have been telling you about the G20 foreign ministers meeting in New Delhi, the expectations from the meeting and the key takeaways. The meeting today saw no joint communique. There was no joint statement because of the differences that could not be reconciled. What led to these differences? Why was there lack of consensus over what? Let me just break it down for you. First things first, the Russia-Ukraine war continued to cast its shadow on the meeting. The US and its European allies sparred with Russia over the war in Ukraine. They called on the group of 20 nations to keep up the pressure on Moscow to end the war. And Russia, meanwhile, hit back at the West. Russia blamed the West for the global political and economic crisis and accused the West of trying to shift the blame for their economic failures onto Russia. Consensus was achieved on over 90% of the issues, but no joint communique was released. Listen in.
Of the issues which concern especially the global south, the developing countries, there was a considerable meeting of minds, and a considerable meeting of minds which has been captured by the outcome document.
Meanwhile, Russia and China jointly criticized the West. The Russian foreign minister said the West is now isolating itself.
The West says Russia should face a strategic defeat. This aligns with their central problem with Russia. They attempt to preserve the hegemony on the world arena.
And that although the West represents itself as the beacon of democracy, Russia says it keeps on bullying other regions. And at the same time, the Russian minister said that Moscow respects New Delhi's stance over the Ukraine conflict. Not just that, Russia accused the West of turning work on the G20 agenda into a farce. And the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, meanwhile, made it clear that this meeting has been marred by Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war against Ukraine. Those were the words used.
And let me begin by thanking our host, India, for setting out an ambitious agenda for this meeting and for its presidency of the G20. Not a single G20 member voted with Russia to oppose that resolution. The chair's statement by India today reaffirmed the declaration issued by the G20 leaders last year in Bali, which, and I quote, strongly condemned the war in Ukraine and stressed it is causing immense human suffering and exacerbating existing fragilities. Every G20 member, and virtually every country, period, continues to bear the costs of Russia's war of aggression, a war that President Putin could end tomorrow if he chose to do so.
China, meanwhile, joined Russia in refusing to support a demand for Moscow to cease the hostilities in Ukraine. The two countries were the only members not to agree to the statement demanding Russia's complete and unconditional withdrawal from the territory of Ukraine. India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, also held bilateral discussions with the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. And while responding to a question asked by WION about his meeting with the Chinese foreign minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar said the talks were about the current state of the relationship between the two sides, which the Indian External Affairs Minister himself described as abnormal.
The bulk of our conversation, understandably, was about the current state of our relationship, which many of you have heard me describe as abnormal, and I think those were among the adjectives that I used in that meeting. We have, there are real problems in that relationship that need to be looked at, that need to be discussed very openly and candidly between us. That's what we sought to do today. We also had a brief discussion on what was happening in the G20 framework.
So as As it turns out, the Russia-Ukraine war continued to remain in the spotlight as expected, and consensus on the war became a casualty during the meeting today. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the updates on the move.